I'm a researcher. First of all, I would like to draw your attention to the Slido link, which can be read on top of us. And please feel free to send us questions throughout the whole discussion. But of course, you will have the chance to raise your hand at the end as well, and to be analog in connection with the questions. Today we are going to talk about the role of education, the role of universities, the role of history. So a lot of perspectives basically on the same subject. And let me start with the first one in connection with universities and the quote. And the quote from Albert Halsey, who is a British sociologist, and basically he wrote the following words or lines 60 years ago. The ideal of a university in England is either Oxford or Cambridge, or a successful imitation of them. This means that the university should be ancient, autonomous, collegiate, dedicated to education rather than training, national rather than provincial, and exclusive to a carefully selected group of students rather than open to all who should wish to attend. And this is from 1962. You both have experience in higher education. What is the present role and educational philosophy of Oxbridge, and what are the differences in Central Europe? Calum, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to join my colleague and neighbor at the institute next to me at MCC. So it's good to be here. I'm director of the Climate Policy Institute, and I suppose my qualification to talk about this is, one, I teach, and I still teach actually at Cambridge, but I'm also, I went to Cambridge as an undergraduate and then Oxford as a graduate, so I know the Oxbridge system quite well. Though I always say I didn't do it well enough the first time, so I had to do it the second time. So it's an interesting question about what is the nature of kind of the Oxbridge system. What's its advantage? It often has the reputation of kind of the Hogwarts of universities because because the name is such a strong brand. I just first want to say one thing about that to demystify it before remystifying it. To demystify it, the reason, of course, that Oxford and Cambridge have this reputation worldwide is actually quite simple. It's because of the British Empire. The top students at the top universities here are no better or worse than the top students at somewhere like Oxbridge. The reason everyone knows the name of Oxbridge is simply because of the good branding, because it was the top universities of a nation that had a global empire. I think that's largely why they're so prominent. And I say this because sometimes there are some MCC students who apply to Oxbridge, and sometimes they feel a little bit daunted, a little bit worried that they wouldn't qualify, they wouldn't be good enough. And I always say, look, you know, I won't say most students, but like, there's a disproportionate number of students at MCC that would fit right in. And it's so, if you are thinking of applying, do it. So that's my pitch. But in terms of the Oxbridge system, so that's demystifying it. To remystify it a little bit, what is the advantage of the Oxbridge system? And I have dramatic music here for my point. So the Oxbridge system is based around the supervision system. So whenever you do an essay, you sit down with the professor, 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. In my day, 20 years ago, we would do it in the pub sometimes and have a glass of wine, and the professor would read your essay, and the professor wrote the book on the subject, and he would take apart your essay. And what you learn through that is a certain sort of batorshag. You learn a bit of courage to stand up for your argument, to argue why you made the argument, and then to concede when your argument failed, and that confidence actually to fail too. But actually, the crucial thing, just to add to this, that I think the system teaches, and it is, I think, different from Central Europe, because my understanding of Hungary is it has quite a Germanic education system. And I've encountered this with students' essays and in many other areas. But the Oxbridge system teaches how to make arguments. And when I got to Cambridge, I struggled, actually, because I struggled initially because no one had taught me how to make arguments. And a lot of the students there went to some of the top public schools they were taught by Oxbridge graduates, and they'd learned how to make arguments. And there's a very simple trick to making an argument. A good argument doesn't begin from what you want to say. It begins from why the reader should care. And it's an interesting inversion. And if I could just give one example of this in a non-academic context. Whenever we write cover letters for jobs, all of you will have written a cover letter for a job or for anything, right? And you will go on to do so. There's an error most people make with a cover letter that indicates the point I'm trying to make. Often when we write cover letters, say I have a job going at CPI, and you write to me saying, "Dear Calum," often the letters you'll write will say, and we all do this, we'll say, "My name is, Attila." And you start with your name, then you say, and then, or if it's an invitation, if I get an invitation to do something, often it will say, "Dear Calum, my name is, Attila. I work for whoever it is. These are the people I work for a few paragraphs. This is the event we're doing." And at the bottom of the letter, it'll say, "And in the context of this, we're inviting you to give a lecture on this date at this time on this topic," right? But the problem is, by that point in the email, if I have a lot of emails, you haven't got that far. If it's a cold email, you don't read that far. The point is, you don't need to say your name at the beginning, because your name, no one cares what your name is until you've earned their interest through the email. And luckily, at the end of the email, if it's an interesting email for the person receiving it, they'll go, "Who wrote to me?" "Oh, Attila. Okay, I'll reply to Attila." My point is, what an email to someone should be like is, "Dear Calum," and then it should start saying, "I'm writing to invite you on X date at X time to give a topic on X topic, to give a talk on this topic. The context is a conference run by these people. Any further details, you can email me back. Yours, Attila." That's the good structure. My point of saying that in the Oxbridge system is that you need to begin from why the reader cares. And I find often the thing that makes, I think, the Anglo education system different, and certainly the Oxbridge system quite different, is they're very intent on beginning from why, not what, if that makes sense. Sorry, it's a long answer. But
yes, in Central Europe, in Hungary, we are closer to the German tradition of the so-called Humboldtian university. Although we had old, middle-age, medieval universities, but honestly speaking, universities are the products of the enlightened absolutist state, and the main purpose of a university is the modernization of the country. I see at least 2 or 3 turning points where this traditional idea of university is challenged by history. One is when, because of the absolutist state and the modernization, a lot of vocational education was pushed up to tertiary level, to higher education level, and we are full of these majors. Medical sciences, most of them, technology, economics. I'm challenging those students here who are the students of economics here, but these are not real disciplines. Spiritual disciplines or Geisteswissenschaften. These are vocational education or a higher level, to be honest. That's one challenge of the traditional idea of university. The second is massification, expansion of education. More and more people are studying in universities. And the third is what the youth sociology calls moratorium in German. That means that you are going to a university not because of certain studies or knowledge or things like that, just to win time and to postpone those uncomfortable life decisions where you have to take long-term responsibility in life, like employment, marriage, family, these kind of things, to postpone as long as possible. So we have mass education. We have a lot of technology and practical things in universities, and we have a lot of young people who are hanging around and having nice time or fun in universities. These are understandable things, but very far from the traditional idea of learning and university.
Thank you. You have both mentioned the changing focus of universities. What is and what should be the role of university professors, lecturers in this new context?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? And almost quite sad that this question has to be asked. I mean, it's interesting. I don't think I'm that old, but it's interesting in 20 years how much the system in the UK has changed. I remember 20 years ago. So when I was a student, the older professors had been teaching there since the 60s or the early 70s. They were kind of old school, professors, and the whole generation has shifted. And I've noticed a difference. They used to, I mean, the classic cliche, right, is the difference between teaching someone how to think and teaching them what to think. And we were often encouraged to argue the opposite. I know MCC has the debating academy, which I think is one of the best things MCC does. I think it's a really good concept. And I used to be part of the Cambridge Union Debating Society, and it was interesting because we would often do debates where the way you learn to debate a point is actually to debate the side you disagree with. And because there's quite an interesting skill in that, because you have to get inside an idea and work out what's its internal logic. And that actually makes you, it doesn't just allow you to make your own side of an argument stronger. It also helps you recognize where you may have indeed been wrong. And that sort of attitude of saying we're going to be dispassionate about it, and we're going to be open to the conflict of ideas. There's kind of a principle behind it that friction, rubbing things together, is a dependable source of illumination. You know, that light, not just heat, comes from friction. So we used to teach people how to think, which is usually the act of having humility, of trying to question your own assumptions. That's really what thinking is, really. I mean, what's the difference between someone who just says stuff and someone who thinks about it? Well, the difference is someone who says something just hears what's going on around them and repeats it, and someone who thinks about it thinks, what are the pros and cons, other arguments? And that's what thinking should be. And but the problem is now, and I find this as someone who has a background in the social sciences, there's a range of assumptions that are built into the frame of reference now in the social sciences that morally guide you, and you can't question them. And I had, just before I came to Hungary, I was talking to some academic friends at a barbecue just before I came, and these academics were inevitably all quite left-wing, just purely based on their dress sense. And it was interesting. One of them said to me, he didn't know, my view of things, but he said to me, he said, "Well, you and I," he says, "we're right-thinking people," by which he meant left-thinking people. But it was an interesting point. And intellectually, I should say that I try and remain completely politically neutral on most issues as best as possible in an analytical context. But it is interesting that he presumed that I would share the moral preconceptions that he does. And that has no place in academia. It has no, like, you guys are all, you're all smart. You don't need me to tell you what to think. What you need from us is the tools to make your own mind up. And I think that used to be the standard. So now it has shifted, and I think this is a pity. But the thing is, one thing I would say about this is that there's a tendency these days to think that history, that now things are getting, there's a lot of ideology now. Some people say woke. I don't really like the term personally, but a lot of these sort of progressive ideas, people think, well, it's just the decline of society. But history tends to do this. I'm pretty sure the 12-year-olds today in 10 years will be like rebels from the consensus. So I'm not too worried about it in the long term. But the current fashion is definitely out of keeping with the traditions that I think made, the British education system at one point, and I do think this, the best in the world.
Professor Rolls?
I agree with Calum. I would like to add some sociological points of view. With this massification, expansion of higher education, a new layer of academic people is emerging. They are underpaid people with a lot of teaching duties, responsibilities in a very schoolish environment. So a lot of lessons, a lot of seminars and lectures, and we call them the academic proletariat now. Underpaid, angry people who cannot enjoy the luxury of the tenured academic position of the professors. The professors are fine, they are good, but they are way under the professors with limited mobility, academic mobility, and they are the typical leftist people in the university. Now they are turning postmodern, this vegan, animal rights, woke, and other micro ideologies are attracting them. Understandingly, sociologically, because their positions are are not very good, and they don't have a future perspective in this respect. Even in Hungary, these people are emerging in big universities, and my ideal is very far from this. We are sitting here in MCC, where you, the students, the audience, have a good chance to experience something very different, which I really believe in, that is the master-discipline relationship. It is an intimate relationship of two personalities as well, and they are both learning. And the student is growing up and becoming a partner, an equal partner of the teacher, but that's a process. And this is just like you have machine-made ice cream, and then you have handmade artigiano gelato, and the quality is strikingly different. So I still believe in this master-discipline relationship, although I know very well that in a decent, good public university with 30,000 students, there is no chance to do that in reality, and they can still produce good results. So I respect the work of my academic colleagues in mass higher education institutions, but I rather sit here in MCC.
My next question is in connection with classical education, because in February, MCC had a double conference or a twin conference dedicated to this topic in Brussels and in Budapest. And we accepted or signed a declaration in connection with the principles of education. According to the second point, the removal of intellectual substance from education dispossesses students of the intellectual legacy of humanity and leads to rootlessness, alienation, and the politicization of the curriculum. What are the most significant challenges and answers in the UK and Central Europe related to the knowledge and skills of students?
I can mention one challenge, which is the emergence of these very soft majors and minors. When we had this traditional hardcore academic content 20 years ago, they were some new subjects and majors and minors made, like Irish studies. I like Ireland, but just, you know.
I'm Scottish, so.
You're Scottish. But there are no Scottish studies, by the way, are there?
Tragedy.
Tragedy, yes. But this kind of specialization, or minority studies still, okay. International, I will challenge now many colleagues here and probably heard their soul, international relations instead of good old hardcore history, you know. It just is the light version. It's like the noodle soup with hot water, the instant one, you know. And many other studies, so kind of studies, majors and minors, which are a little bit like the light version of the traditional, difficult, heavy, multi-layer, dialectic, knowledge-intensive, old-fashioned majors and minors. So one is the disciplinary field, and it is closely related to the teachers of these soft areas who have to create content for these soft areas, and sometimes it is light, semi-political content instead of disciplinary. We have another, on the other pole, we have another challenger that is disciplinary barbarism, when we forget the studium generale idea, the general studies or the septem artes liberales, and instead of hardcore professors are teaching, let's say, data-driven microeconomics, and they are killing students on the exam, and they are fanatical believer of the big data application of rational choice theory and things like that. So too much specialization in certain closed disciplinary areas, that is also a sign of it. Generally, when I see disciplinary areas moving towards increasing mathematization, especially economics, that is for me a safe sign of decline, intellectual decline. It sounds like a paradox because it's rewarded as something more and more serious and scientific. But the truth, I think, that's my opinion, of course, is the opposite. That's a sign of intellectual decline.
I'd agree, actually, with everything you said. But, I mean, when I think about Anglo culture and what's happening to education, and I should say, by the way, education, let me just pull back for a sec. I mean, when we think about what is culture, I believe culture is just the sedimented layers of best practice we have for solving problems. And I don't mean purely a practical problem. Life is nothing but a series of problems. What should I dress in today? What's the weather like? Where should I get some food? I'm hungry. We're always solving problems. That's what we do. We often forget how many problems the world presents us because we've constructed these societies that solve so many for us. But then in the context of what is education? Well, education is the means by which a culture passes on its best practice for solving problems to the next generation. So why do I talk about that? Well, I think that if you see education as being about solving various problems, well, education, I think, has developed a lot of problems of its own now, which need to be solved. The Anglo system's always had an emphasis on, as I've said, argumentation. And there's a difference. Sometimes I find, I'm not generalizing too much here, but sometimes I find when I read student essays, sometimes here actually, I'll read the student essay and beautifully written when they're written in English, incredible English, better actually than some of my English students. I'm not joking on that. But also a very good factual content. But sometimes I get to the end of the essay and I think, well, I'm not sure what they've told me. Good facts, but where's the argument? Whereas often if I read a British essay, I'll think, compelling argument, I wish they'd put some facts in. And so there's an interesting difference that I find here, the education system, and speaking to Hungarian friends that they've confirmed this is often what happens, is that you guys are taught a lot of good factual knowledge, but perhaps not as encouraged as much to structure it as an argument. And in the UK, everyone says, be yourself, think independently, make an argument. But then often there's no facts. So we have a factual problem in the UK. But we also now actually have an argumentative problem because, as you pointed out, increasingly what's happening in universities is people are doing degrees not in fundamental disciplines. And a discipline is about, think about what the word discipline means. Discipline is about a degree of self-restraint. It's not always about knowing everything. It's showing restraint in what you do. And that often comes into structure because you want to say what you want to say at the beginning of the paper. But first you've got to first say why the reader should care, and then you get to what you want to say. You know, and it's a discipline just of restraint, not to say it all right away. You see what I mean? So we used to have disciplines. I mean, whatever your views on economics, it's still in general a discipline. But now people will be doing degrees in not anthropology, but the anthropology of like medical anthropology or the anthropology of climate change or something. People won't study history, or they'll do a master's in a very particular narrow framing of history. And so we're getting away from arguments because now we're teaching thematic knowledge rather than a disciplinary approach. And this makes someone very narrow because what education should be giving people is the tools by which they can analyze any problem, regardless of whether they are experts in that field. The final thing I'd say, I think is a problem, and I think you hinted at this by talking about science, is that because the sciences have been because STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths, because this has been so successful at an economic level, we think sometimes it's the only game in town. It's the only valid form of education. And sometimes it's a huge error we all fall into, where we think the non-sciences, the humanities, the social sciences, are just like amateur or immature sciences, that one day they'll grow up and be as rigorous as the sciences. And I would just want to say one thing on that. That will never happen because they have fundamentally different subjects. And in a structured way, a very simple distinction, actually. The study of physical things, chemistry, physics, to some extent biology, certainly maths, the study of that is a unity. The laws of physics and chemistry apply equally to everything, everywhere, right? So it's a unity. The difference is the study of humanity is, by definition, the study of plurality, that you and I all see the world slightly differently. Indeed, I disagree with myself throughout the day, depending on how many cups of tea I've drunk. And that's, again, it's not a fault, it's a feature of being human. We are a plurality. That's not a problem. That's what makes us who we are, right? And so the subject of the humanities is the study of objective pluralism. We are objectively plural. We're not objectively one thing. Whereas the study of science is objectively singular. There is just one thing we're trying to find everywhere. That's why they'll never be the same thing. And the big error we have in the culture now is we have across everywhere, in every area of the culture, regardless of your politics, one thing we have an epidemic of, or a pandemic of, is hubris. The hubris to believe that there is only one truth and I have it and they don't, and we should apply it to them. I think that's a hubris, and it's a hubris born of a very scientistic view of the world, a very monistic view of the world, a view that there is one thing, a unity. But actually, we're a plurality. And the irony is, unless we can acknowledge there is a plurality, we will never actually have any unity. We'll always be fighting each other if everyone believes they have a monopoly of the truth. So that's my thought of the education system in the UK is suffering problems with facts, arguments, but also I think we are victims of the success of science as well.
Let's continue with a more classical and fundamental subject, history, which is basically a heated battlefield nowadays. And every discussion in Western Europe is in connection with the decolonization of the curriculum. And my question is in connection with that, what might be the conservative answer for this challenge?
Well, Hungary was not necessarily a colonial power in history, so I would like to hear first Calum in this respect.
Okay, well,
that's a joke.
No, it's still. I still feel guilty about it. My family were in India, so it's yeah. So it's interesting, with this idea of decolonizing curriculums. First of all, it's funny sometimes when I hear about medieval studies or medieval history being decolonized, because the colonization, as we think of it, in terms of the sort of Western European colonization period, was a product of arguably the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution and so on, which is all modern, basically, modernity, depending how you define it, 15, 17, the Reformations, maybe the printing press was involved. So medieval history is sort of pre-colonial in terms of the modern sort of colonization. But I think more relevantly, so for you guys, assuming most of you are Hungarian, you may not see much of a distinction between Britain and the United States. And I can tell you there is a difference. And there's a great phrase that says, England and America are two nations divided by common language. And I think it's very true that we sound like we're speaking the same language, but we speak very differently. And there's a famous example of this, that the Brits, if a Brit says to you, not bad, it means very good. And if they say very good, it means not bad. It's pretty bad. And the Americans always take us very literally. So. But here's what I hear, is that when I hear this idea of decolonizing curriculums in the UK, what I hear is the rhetoric of us being colonized by America's moral panics. Now, if you think of colonialism, when Britain went off to, well, everywhere, really, apart from Hungary, and colonized everyone, what we did is we went there and we basically thought, look at these bunch of uncivilized people. We got to bring them civility, which was Christianity or whatever it was, and railways, the telegraph, all these things. And so we looked at their morals and thought they should be like us, they should be Christian and so on. And it wasn't unique to the UK, but that was that sense of moral colonization, right? But now I feel the Americans have put on their pith helmets, their empire helmets, and they've come into Britain, and they are trying to tell us how we should decolonize everything. And so so when I hear the phrase decolonization, what I hear is colonization. It's us being colonized by the American, cultural biradalom, So so that's my thought on that. It's an interesting experience. And as a country that has recently lost its colonies, in a sense, though we still hang on to Gibraltar, which is an important place. I think we're quite conscious of the hubris of saying decolonization in the way the Americans aren't yet.
We have a project in the Learning Institute called Learning from Asia in Education. And we use there with Asian PhD students the so-called Asia method, which is a gradual decolonization of their mind. They are using more Asian references and more Asian approaches to understand better their own educational system, although they are very keen on maintaining Western intellectual frames as well. So it's not a war, it is just about the balance. In the case of Hungary, I wouldn't put this issue so sharply, like decolonization, but in education, especially in social sciences, we have Anglo-Saxon intellectual frames of reference all over. It is because of the World Bank, OECD, and even the European Union is pushing these frames. But the irony in the thing is that we don't have Anglo-Saxon social systems, so these frames, they don't fit into our daily realities. And the question is whether we can raise again some Central European continental frames to rebalance this kind of mostly American influences. I'm not talking against them, I'm talking about a new balance. The problem from an intellectual point of view is the lack of the German input in that. Germany has lost its own frame of references. It is following the Anglo-Saxon since the Second World War, which was a successful project for such a long time for them. But they would need to look for their own models again and traditions as well, and they don't do it. And until the Germans don't make their homeworks in this region, the smaller countries cannot substitute this vacuum or shortage in a short term.
Can I add something, actually? You just made me think of it.
Geopolitical, sorry.
No, but it's interesting, and you've made me think. It's not related, but it made me think of it. So I think it's worth pulling back from this concept of woke for a second and understand. I think we often see it as a pathology, like a disease that needs to be cured. My view is it's actually a symptom of a disease that needs to be cured, and I think it's an important distinction to make because. If you look at, so around 1980, what began was this period that we now call the neoliberal period, which arguably we're still in, this idea where there was no value outside of the market, that the market will fix all things. Now, if it was in the 1980s then that governments deregulated under Reagan and Thatcher. Obviously in Hungary, you guys experienced quite shock neoliberalism in the 1990s because the Washington consensus hit the post-communist countries ideologically, because the Americans said, this is the way to become like us, adopt this policy. And obviously it had a huge number of negative consequences for Russia or Hungary and various countries. But what's interesting about neoliberalism is this idea that everyone is an entrepreneur. And it's very interesting, a sign of how culturally pervasive that idea is evident across many areas of culture you wouldn't think. So for instance, if in the 1970s you were working out, you were a weird guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger working out, right? But by the 1980s, there were gyms opening across America. Why? Because suddenly people saw themselves as entrepreneurs of their body, right? Of their health, not just their wealth, but of their health. And this is where you saw the rise of gym culture, the running magazines, the working out magazines, all this stuff came from that, which is now so in the culture that we don't even think it came from somewhere. But action heroes in the 1970s were normal-looking guys. By the 1980s, they were these superhuman guys, right? But now what's interesting, in the last 10 years, we're entrepreneurs not just of our wealth or our health, but also ourself. We are in the digital world, we are constantly being told to perfect ourselves morally, to become more and more moral people, which is a lot of what the woke thing is. For me, it's simply the expression in moral terms of the neoliberal ideas from the 1980s. And I think one of the reasons it's so appealing to people, and this speaks to what you were saying earlier about the underpaid academics, think of the people who are these woke people, right, as basically the modern equivalent of Franciscan monks. Because the Franciscans had nothing, right? The whole point is they give away material, they're barefooted, but they have their virtue. Now, if you're a 25-year-old living in London or New York City, you've not got much. You've got $200,000 of student debt, you can't afford a house, your job doesn't pay you well, and it doesn't have a permanent contract, you'll probably be able to achieve, you foresee achieving none of the things your parents have to give you the overpriced education, having a house, getting married, and so on. You know, all this stuff is gone. And so what do these people, what can they do? They can say, well, I have nothing, but I have my virtue. And I think we need to have some empathy for that, because wouldn't you? I mean, it's an understandable thing. And so I think a lot of it needs to be understood. I think so often we focus on woke as a disease to be cured. But for me, it's a symptom of a disease that does need to be cured. And I'd actually say, as an additional point on that, that the disease doesn't just affect the left. If you look at the Trump phenomenon in the States, the people who vote for Trump are people who've been, again, affected by a neoliberal economy that took working class businesses and sent them overseas, car companies. And so they are also victims of that system. So when people said, well, the people who vote for Trump are a basket of deplorables, you know, as Hillary Clinton said, she was seeing them as a disease that was in need of a cure. But again, they're a symptom. And the two sides are actually, for me, symmetrical symptoms of the same disease in need of a cure, but they keep thinking each other are the disease and themselves the cure. And as long as we're misdiagnosing the problem, we remain medieval in how we think about social problems. Like, we are all modern in how we think about problems of the body, right? We no longer confuse symptom and pathology. But we are all still medieval, all of us. We are all still medieval in how we think about the body politic, because we are constantly confusing symptom and pathology, in my view. And it's so I mentioned this because you made me think of it, but this idea of woke, I think we need to look at it a little bit more dispassionately as a symptom, not a disease, because it's not great, and the symptoms can still kill you, you know. But I think unless you diagnose the problem, you can't cure it.
Thank you. In the meantime, we invite you to submit your questions through Slido. So let's check the website and the code and submit your questions. Or if you are so old school, you can take notes and raise your hand afterwards.
Love old school.
Moving on, in connection with history education, we can see that new actors are entering this battlefield, basically. For example, the Council of Europe, which established an international cooperation titled Observatory on History Education, and also there was a huge chaos and huge uprising in connection with the European Parliament decision dedicated to or advocating for a common European historical consciousness this January. Instead of national histories, they propose a unified perspective of the European continent. What do you think of this phenomena?
Hungarian history teaching traditionally, since the late 80s, offered a very, very large proportion of the curriculum for European history. And the reason is very simple. Since the foundation of the Hungarian state, so year 1000, there is not a single important Hungarian historical event which can be understood without the European and geopolitical context. So everything happens in a European context. There is no a special isolated Hungarian history. So the material is there. What the European Parliament is pushing is not the increase of the European percentage of the curriculum. It's not about that. What they are pushing is a hybrid identity and a new content in history teaching which nurtures and strengthens this hybrid identity of so-called Europeness, which is strictly connected to the European Union. One example, Serbia is a European country, but not a member of the EU. Serbia is not concerned with these things. It's about a new identity building, which is EU-based. EU is a political and an economic organization for cooperation and peace, so it's interesting. And the second thing is that the natural connection towards a common European history has been so far the corridor of Hungarianness. So as a Hungarian, I am European. That's an automatic connection. Italians are Europeans. Spanish are Europeans in their own Spanish way. But what they want now is to avoid this corridor and get into a hybrid European house when there is a hybrid identity. Other identities. For instance, when I was young, my parents connected to other people basically through personal sympathy of certain virtues or professional performance, like a good hardworking person, respectable family, things like that. Now the people are connecting to each other on the basis of their eating habits, like, are you vegan too? Which is hard to understand for my generation, that what do you eat is a connection to other people. Or identity preferences, like I'm half fluid. I don't go into the details of these sexual identities. That's surrealistic, and this kind of hybrid identity is in the question now, whether we can build it without national identity. Here, that's my last comment about it. There is a very famous house at the corner of the street. It's a 4 or 3 store tall house made in the 60s. And why is it famous? Because the builders has forgot to build stairs in the house. It was just a mistake, architectural design mistake, and no elevator either. So it was built to the house later. So once you don't have your local identity, your regional identity, your national identity, how can you enter the second floor of this European house, or the third floor? No elevator and no stairs. Okay?
So I mentioned earlier this idea of plurality, of the essence of being human is not unity as such. I don't mean that we'd never fight. I just mean the plurality of perspective is natural, you know, not just between each other, but even within ourselves. I think, as Forrester said, the only story worth telling is the human heart in conflict with itself, and that speaks to that. But the reason I mention it is that Europe is plural. Of course it is. There's many different cultures, many different languages. And again, that's not a fault, it's a feature. And it's not just a feature, it's a strength. About 21 years ago, a book came out called Guns, Germs, and Steel by an American scholar called Jared Diamond. And now you can take issue with his argument in a few ways, but he made a very interesting argument. He was trying to understand, why did Europe rise when it did, when other cultures that were actually more advanced than Europe didn't? So why did China, interesting week to be talking about China in Hungary, why did China not become Europe? Why did it not have the Industrial Revolution and so on? And his argument was very interesting. He said, actually, the fact that China was very unified by these 2 rivers and a great plain under one emperor, that would sound, you'd think, like the grounds for progress. But actually it wasn't, because the most important priority of the emperor was to maintain his power and have no threats, right? Whereas in Europe, you had, because of the geography of not rivers uniting everything, but mountain ranges dividing Italy from the north and Spain from France and so on, what it meant is if you had a challenging idea and you were persecuted, you could flee across the mountains somewhere else. And so he argues that Europe's strength is in its plurality, and his argument's problematic in terms of reducing it very much to geography. But I think that his point is that Europe's strength is precisely its plurality. And so when there's an effort to try and find the sort of objective truth of European history in some sense, I'm not really sure who it's for. And an analogy for this is map making. There is no such thing as an objective map. Okay, there's a hiker's map, there's a driver's map, there's an Air Force map. I was saying to him before, my father was a fighter pilot, and he still has his old maps of the UK. He used to bomb up and down the UK at 800 miles an hour. And his maps are not very useful unless you're traveling at 800 miles an hour, because the features on the map are useful if you see them at 800 miles an hour. Now, that's very different from a driver's map where you see England at 60 miles an hour. which is very different from a hiker's map, which you see it at 5 miles an hour. Different features on the map. All of these maps have different purposes because they have different audiences, right? They are subjective. Map making is inherently subjective. You begin, and I said earlier about making arguments, you begin not from what you want to say, but why the reader should read it. And maps are always written from the reader's perspective. What is your use? What are you using it for? And history is the same, really. Like, you can't separate history from the perspective of who's talking about it. And so this notion that there is some sort of Archimedean point, a bird's eye view of Europe that we can talk about history from, it seems to me I mean, there are some general things we can agree on, sure. But those general agreements tend to actually be more moral points, really. So I think that there's a problem in that project, in the spirit of it, I think.
Before giving the floor to the audience, I have one last question in connection with a hypothetical idea. We have a colleague from the UK called Catherine Burbersin. She visited us last year, and basically she escaped the education system of the United Kingdom and found her own school based on conservative ideas. If you were the founder of a private and autonomous school in the UK or Hungary respectively, with sufficient funding, which is very important, what principles and emphasis would you introduce?
School or university?
School.
Take it first. I mean, it's interesting. The actual phrasing you've put in that was that you had an interesting phrase that if sufficiently funded, and that's the crux, right? Because one of the reasons that schools, I think in the UK are, particularly if you take the private schools, one of the reasons that they've gone a bit awry, they've gone off-piste a little bit recently and become quite ideological, is that they're not well funded enough. They need to keep getting in the students, making money, and so on. They've much more businesses now than they used to be. So the system around the British private schools have shifted a lot, because it used to be mostly that the students were British. Why? Well, because if you were a military officer who was stationed abroad, your children could go to one of these schools, and the military would pay for it. But then in the mid-1990s, the military downsized. In 1994, the funding for the military dropped dramatically after the Cold War. And so the main source of students to most of these public schools disappeared, and then they started to have to look elsewhere abroad. So I was at a private school for 2 years when I was in high school, and I was in a boarding house, and most of the kids in the boarding house were from Hong Kong. And then there was the Hong Kong crisis for the economy, and they all disappeared. And I think then it was from Singapore. But so the money element determines a lot of this. But if I was going to have a single value rather than a price, in a sense, I'd say that there's we were talking about this earlier, there's a great quote from T.S. Eliot, and he said, the only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. And I said before, we have a pandemic in the world right now of hubris. I think everyone really believes that their view is the only view on any issue. And look, the problem is with that, if you fight fire with fire, you end up with inferno, a much bigger fire. And we live in a culture now where we're all being taught to pick our tribe, fight the fight. It doesn't end well if we can't find the common ground or understand at least the problems another side is facing. Like when I said about the woke people, we can say, well, their ideology is stupid. But we can also say, well, what are the problems they're facing? Like, why are they reaching for this? And the people who criticize the Trump supporters and say they're a bunch of racists or something, well, we could also look at it and say, what privations have they suffered the last 30, 40 years? And so there's a lack of mutual empathy. And I think the humility, and this comes back to the Oxbridge system, of forcing you to question your own assumptions. Because there is a certain humility in that, because you start to understand that you are not what you believe. And this is a great danger we have now, because we live in the social media age. And the problem with Twitter, as an example, is that you are what you believe. Because you don't meet someone on Twitter. What you see is a profile with a few words of all their hashtags, whatever they believe, So you become what you online, you are by definition what you believe. And so then when someone criticizes what you believe, you inevitably take it personally. And so it's interesting, we're taking everything very personally now, and there's not the humility to separate from those things and to be open to other ideas. So if I set up a school, it'd be around this idea of humility, which, by the way, is a pretty strong Christian virtue. So it's, and I wasn't particularly raised Christian, but I think the that idea of that humility to reflect and apologize and forgive and all these things, which is all the common themes, always humility, is completely out of fashion in the culture right now, certainly in the Anglosphere.
Well, creating another private special school doesn't make too much sense for me. When I will be an old man, probably I will make that as a last game of my life, to establish such a school with a trivium and a quadrivium, a traditional knowledge-intensive, nice school for nice people, but the social impact will be obviously minimal. What I think it's a much better approach is, and that sounds very strange in this Scraton cafe here, is the MCC approach. Namely, you let the schools work as they do. It's a swamp organization of regulations, finances, state administration, and the parents, and who are terrible, and the teachers who are even worse. Let them work, and then concentrate on students and collect some of them and provide them some extra, which is outside of the education system. This additional component is the MCC. It can be done better than we do now, but it's a very interesting approach, and I think the social impact is much bigger than create another interesting school in Budapest.
I just want to say something interesting. As a foreigner who's been working for MCC for 3 years, most már 3 éve vagyok itt. 3 years ago I came here, yeah. So, and it's been interesting with MCC because there's nothing like it in the UK. It's a really interesting structure, and it's not just MCC. There's JUS for law students over on the Pest side. There's something called Proton, I think, for social science students. There are a number of these organizations, and MCC is the biggest, I think. But it's interesting because the difference between Hungary and the UK is that the UK has been... Hungary has suffered due to its history, but the UK, I think, has been pickled by its success, that we've had things go so well for us for so long that we kind of believe that we just had the right theory, and let's export that. Let's take it to Afghanistan, show them how that's done, you know, and to everyone. And so, but we were very lucky. The British history is just one lucky escape or near miss after another. The Spanish Armada sank because of bad weather. If it wasn't for that, we'd all sound like Rodrigo. So, Ballister, who's a fellow here, if no one knows Rodrigo. But the point is that in the UK, one thing I quite like being here is because you guys know the cost of losing things. There is people I think recognize the value of having things with the potential of things like MCC. Whereas in the UK, I don't think anyone cares. And so we're really at risk. Like when cultures collapse, they don't tend to collapse because they get invaded as such. They tend to collapse because people stop believing in it, and they stop being vigilant to maintain it. They don't think there's anything valuable to maintain. And that's why we see decolonizing of curriculums, because we think we're so secure, we can decolonize everything in our culture, we can strip away our own history, because there'll be something of us left after that. And it's such hubris in that idea. And I think the thing that's been quite nice being here is that I once read that Hungarians' national obsession is with history, for better and worse, I think. But it's interesting, it's a culture that's very much aware of its history. And in the UK, we have kind of forgotten about it. We don't really care. And I think that's a great cost that comes with that. But the fact that you guys know the impact of history, because you've suffered quite a lot from it, is something we've forgotten about in the UK. And so we don't have institutes like MCC that recognize there is a problem to be solved. We just think things will just continue as they are. So I'm not trying to pitch MCC to anyone as such, but it's an interesting institute. There's nothing like this in the UK.
A very short additional thing, because I sounded too traditional. Let's be a bit more cosmopolitan for a moment. I would import from East Asia one approach into this new school. That is the inclusion of the body in the learning process. Because I feel, that's my 22 years of Chinese martial art experience as well. I feel sometimes pity when I see you wrestling with brain in the university, before that the high school, then the university. After university you are learning again these things here in MCC, and it's mostly about brain, cognitive things. And nobody involves the body into the learning process. So in my MCC, this kind of routines and exercises would be part of the curriculum.
Thank you very much for this. We have wonderful questions from the audience. Let me start with this one. Where should I study to become a well-known expert? Is it possible to make it with a Hungarian degree, or is it the top 100 universities which is a must? Maybe there is a distinction between a well-known expert and a successful expert, but yeah.
Well, I would say if the goal is to be well known, I mean, you can become well known without being an expert in anything. I mean, there's some of the most well known people don't know anything, so I don't think that's a requirement. And sometimes knowing something can lead to being obscure. So you got to think about, I suppose, what the goal is. But I think ultimately, you know what? I once when I was at Cambridge, actually, I had a chat once with the master of the college, who was Amartya Sen at the time, and Amartya Sen was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and I wasn't sure what to say to him. We had drinks, and I was like, so I said, what's the most important thing do you find for students to get in here? And he just said, good teachers. And I thought about it, and I went through 7 schools. My brothers went through 17 schools. Okay, so my education is really messed up because my family moved a lot. And so, for instance, I've studied the beginning and the end of A Midsummer's Night's Dream, the Shakespeare play, but I've never read the middle, because we're either beginning it or finishing it when I got to school. But good teachers, I look back and I had 1 or 2 amazing teachers, and I wish I could be in contact with them just to send them a letter, because I owe everything to them. And what they taught was actually not the facts, really. They taught the passion of their subject. And if you can find the passion of a subject, then you don't need even a formal education, quite honestly. And you certainly don't need the top 100, whatever that means. You know, I think our fate is in our control, but mostly if you have passion for something, then even if you may become successful in the world's eyes, but even if you don't, you'll be enjoying yourself, which I think matters.
Okay, one maybe for János. Can we build a stairs or elevator somehow between those levels, regional, national, or European identity? If yes, is it going to reduce the value of the house?
No, I think it's a natural linkage. In the traditional German paradigm, you have first this Heimatkunde, a kind of, you know, your neighboring region and landscape and cities and villages, then you know your region, then your country. Like I think Edinburgh and Glasgow are very different places, to put it diplomatically. So first you know, let's say Glasgow, and then then Scotland, and then this whole problem of being British at the same time, and then the global outlook, some Europe including. So that these are layers, and this is the normal way, like the onion thing. This is the normal way of identity. And I met sometimes people, these are children of diplomats who travel too much. They intermarry, so different countries in the marriage. They are traveling all around the world, and the children are rootless to some extent. And let's say when they finish their career in Brussels, the children are raised in Brussels schools, where there are many similar children in those schools, and they become like a Brussels identity children or adults or something like that. And I felt pity for them. That's not the good way. So it's a natural thing, and you already, if you're Hungarians, you already possess the layers and the elevator. Your studies are to polish the layers and the elevator, but you already had the healthy structure.
One last question. I read that the structure of university changed from republic of scholars to shareholder university. What are your opinion on this phenomenon? From republic to shareholder.
I'm not sure I understand the distinction, actually. I've not actually heard this distinction. Could you explain the difference? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I wrote the question, and it was referring that due to the more organizational autonomy which the universities receive, actually it is not more republic of scholars. I mean that the rector is, yes, the rector is the head, but actually, for example, they have a chancellor who is liable for running the operations, or he is actually more a manager, and the rector still remained the kind of first in the equals.
Oh, you're saying basically the shift from being an institution as an end in itself to a means to an economic end, like a business. Is that the distinction? Yeah, so this is interesting, and actually it's something I wanted to bring up earlier when you were talking about these underpaid scholars. One of the problems that's happened in the British system is the universities have been taken over by what's known as audit culture, where it's a sort of, again, very neoliberal business model that the universities their success must be measured by KPIs, not the Climate Policy Institute, but the key performance indicators, and that I remember being in a lecture and they brought in KPIs, they brought in audit culture where we would audit the lecture. So at the end of the lecture, we were given a piece of paper, in like 2002 it came in, where we would say how good the lecture was. And I remember feeling really embarrassed writing this, because I thought, who am I? I'm 18, like, this is the professors who've been doing it, and I'm testing them. This feels really insolent, you know, I didn't like the feeling of it. And I remember 10 years later, I was speaking to a professor, and I was telling him how much I hate this audit culture because I think it's against the spirit of the university. It's very economical, very technocratic. And he said something really interesting. He says, he just said, he had a cigarette, he went, I know when there's a good lecturer. I can stand outside the lecture hall and I can feel the buzz. And I said, that's interesting. What do you mean? He says, I've been doing this 25 years. I just know. And that's most people who are good at things, is that if you find a good doctor, there's a very quick little analogy to this. About 5 years ago, I had a nerve injury in my back and a lot of pain, didn't know what it was. And I went to see this doctor, and he looked at me and he moved my leg around and he goes, well, he says, I can't give you any proof, but it's sciatica. And I thought, that's interesting. How do you know that? He goes, I've been doing this 35 years. I just know. And I said, I can't explain it to you. I just know. It's just experience. And there's something that the education system and the whole culture is losing, is the value we put on experience, on people who just know it because they've done it for a long time. They don't need to overthink it. They don't need to explain it. And in this culture where they're run as businesses instead of just as places where you go to meet someone who's a master of their discipline and you learn from them, we've lost this. We focus on the letter of education and the letters you get at the end, but not the spirit of it. And so if the question is what do I make of the shift from a Republican to a shareholder system, or Republic to shareholder system, I think it's terrible. But this is, again, the neoliberal mission creep infecting all areas of culture. And I think we should push back against it.
I'm a little bit softer in this direction, so I can imagine sometimes refreshing winds in the academia from business. According to the classic triangle of Robert Clark, 3 actors can rule a university. One is the state bureaucracy, or the academic oligarchy, those Senate people, the professors, and the third is business actors. And once they have a healthy balance, these 3 forces, that is a nice live dynamic university. Obviously, the business shouldn't have a decisive say in curricular matters or in teaching methods and so and so. They do have now, which is a mistake. And the state bureaucracy should be limited, obviously, within the campus very much. But if you let these Republican people, the academic oligarchy, to rule the university, then the professors will rule the university, and they will make the academic slaves, the proletariat, work on a daily basis. So the balance is probably the healthy approach. in some cultures, they can manage these contradictions within the campus, and that is, I think, the most important thing. And there are other cultures where the actors want to win and beat others. Hungary is learning this balancing culture with this foundational university initiatives, and it will take a long time for us to understand that we don't have to win and beat the others or push them out from the scene.
Unfortunately, our time is up, but we invite everybody to ask questions informally after the panel. Calum, János, thank you for your participation and your contributions.
Szívesen.
And thank you. And let me invite you for MCC Learning Institute's next events, which will come next week. On the 15th of May, we will host Eva Gyarmati and Zoltán Glovicki and János with a very interesting debate. And the week after, on the 21st of May, we will host Joanna Williams in the topic of the politicization of education, and we welcome you at those panels as well. Thank you.
In the good old times, we also would invite you for pogača and chai latte and other delicacies, but now we don't have a chance for that. Okay, enjoy the day.